The morning sun rose slowly over the wide fields, painting the land in shades of gold, but the farm still looked tired, as if it carried the weight of many hard seasons. John, a middle-aged farmer, stood at the edge of his field with a heavy heart. His land stretched far and wide, yet the soil seemed dry, the fences broken and the animals weak. He had worked these fields since his youth, but the years had been unkind. Storms had ruined his crops. Prices had fallen, and loneliness had become his only companion. For weeks he had thought about giving up, but each time he looked at the old farmhouse that his father built with his bare hands, he could not bring himself to walk away. He needed help. His body was not strong like before, and he could not care for the farm alone anymore. That morning, with a sigh, John walked back inside and sat at the wooden table. On the table lay a crumpled piece of paper. He took a pen, straightened his back, and began to write. Help wanted. Farm workers, shelter and food provided, hard work required, no questions asked. He stared at the simple words. They did not look special, but to him this ad was his last hope. If no one came, then the farm would die. He carried the note to the small town nearby, pinned it on the notice board, and walked back to his lonely land. Days passed. At first, no one came. John spent his mornings fixing fences, his afternoons feeding animals, and his nights staring at the empty table, wondering if he had made a mistake. Sometimes people from town stopped to read the ad, but they only shook their heads. No one wanted the work. It was too far, too hard, and paid too little. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air grew cool, John sat outside with a cup of weak tea in his hand. The road that led to his farm was always empty at that hour, but on this day, he noticed movement. He narrowed his eyes and saw shapes coming closer. At first, he thought it was a group of travelers, maybe locals passing through. But as they drew near, his heart beat faster. Their forms were tall and strange, their steps heavy with exhaustion. There were 5 of them, cloaked in worn garments, carrying small bundles that looked lighter than air. As they came closer, John realized they were not human. Their skin had different shades, some pale silver, others faintly blue, and one had markings like soft scars glowing faintly under the fading light. Their faces carried deep sorrow, and their eyes held pain. These were alien women. When they finally reached the gate, John noticed something else. Each of them wore a piece of black cloth tied around their arms or necks, a symbol of mourning. They were widows. He could see it in the way they carried themselves. In the silence between their heavy breaths, one of them stepped forward. She was taller than John, her eyes a deep shade of violet. Her voice was rough yet trembling when she spoke. "Human farmer, we saw your ad," she said slowly, her accent thick but clear enough to understand. We need work, but more than that, we need shelter." John's hand tightened on his cup. He had expected maybe a young man from town, maybe a poor family looking for a chance. He never imagined 5 alien widows standing at his gate. Their faces looked tired, their bodies weak, but there was something in their eyes, desperation, fear, and a small spark of hope. Another woman stepped forward, younger than the first, with silver streaks in her hair, though her face was soft and youthful. "We have no one left," she whispered. "Our husbands died in the war. Our homes burned. The towns will not take us in. They say we are cursed. They say widows bring only misfortune." Her voice broke, and her hands trembled as she held her small bundle close. John swallowed hard. His heart was torn. He had heard stories of alien wars, of human settlements attacked, of widows and orphans scattered across the land. Many humans despised them, blaming them for old wounds. His neighbors would never forgive him if he brought these women onto his farm. Yet as he looked at them, he saw not enemies, but broken souls. Left out in the cold, the first widow's eyes met his. "We will work harder than any human," she promised. "We ask for no pay, only food, shelter, and safety." Silence fell over the farm, broken only by the sound of the evening wind. John's mind raced. He could shut the gate and send them away, pretend he never saw them. That would be the safer path. But his heart ached as he looked at their faces, 5 lives hanging on his decision. The cup of tea in his hand had gone cold. He set it down, walked slowly to the gate, and looked at them closely. "You've come to the wrong farm," he said softly. His words made their shoulders sag, and one of them covered her face, preparing for rejection. But John was not finished. He took a deep breath. "This farm isn't much," he continued. "But if you're willing to work, you'll find shelter here." For a moment, they did not move, as if his words were too heavy to believe. Then the tall widow lowered her head, her voice trembling. "Thank you, human farmer." John nodded, though worry gnawed at his heart. He knew this choice would change everything. The quiet farm would no longer be the same, and the world outside his fences would not stay silent for long. As night fell, 5 alien widows stepped onto the farm, their shadows stretching across the land. The story had only begun, and John knew that whatever came next would test him more than any season of drought. The farmhouse was quiet that night, but John could not sleep. The old clock on the wall ticked louder than ever, and each sound felt like a reminder of the choice he had made. He had let 5 alien widows step into his life, and now they slept in the barn, resting on hay and old blankets he had given them. Outside, the crickets sang and the wind shook the wooden shutters, but inside his chest, unease kept him awake. At dawn, he walked to the barn, half expecting to find it empty, but when he pushed the door open, he froze. The women were still there, huddled together like a family. Their faces looked softer in the morning light, no longer fierce or strange, only tired and fragile. One of them had been crying, her cheeks still wet. But when she saw John, she wiped her tears and sat straighter. The tall widow, the one who spoke first last night, rose to her feet. Her violet eyes were steady, though shadows of grief lingered in them. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect. "We are in your debt, human farmer," she said slowly. "But you must know our truth. You deserve to hear it before you decide if we stay." John nodded, his arms crossed against the chill of morning air. He said nothing, waiting. The younger widow with silver-streaked hair stepped forward. She clutched her bundle tightly. It was not food or clothes, but a folded piece of fabric worn and stained. She opened it carefully, showing what was inside. It was a broken piece of metal armor, cracked and blackened. "This belonged to my husband," she whispered. Her voice was fragile, yet every word cut like a blade. "He fought in the war, he did not return. The soldiers brought me this as proof of his death. That day I lost not just him, but also my home, my place, my future." Her hands trembled as she pressed the metal to her chest. John felt a weight inside his own chest. He had never been in their war, but he had seen how it destroyed lives, human and alien alike. Another widow spoke, her voice harsh but filled with pain. Her skin carried faint glowing lines that pulsed with her heartbeat. "My husband was not a soldier," she said. "He was a healer. He tended to the wounded. He was killed for showing mercy to humans. They called him a traitor. They burned our home. I escaped with nothing but ashes in my hair." Her eyes glistened, and for a moment her body shook. As if the memory itself still burned, John swallowed. He felt the weight of their grief pressing into him, heavier than the soil he plowed every season. He wanted to look away, but he could not. Their voices demanded to be heard. The third widow, smaller than the rest, clutched a necklace in her hand, a small carved stone tied with thread. She did not look up when she spoke. "I had children," she whispered. Her words broke, forcing her to pause. "When the soldiers came, I tried to protect them, but they were taken. I searched, I begged, but no one would help. They said a widow had no voice, no worth. I have nothing left, only this necklace." She kissed the stone, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. John's throat tightened. He turned his gaze to the barn floor, unable to watch her pain for too long. "You are." Fourth widow's voice was colder, her face sharp, her eyes burning with anger. "I was banished by my own clan," she spat. "They said a woman without a husband is weak, a burden, useless. I begged them for shelter, but they cast me out. I wandered from village to village only to be cursed, spit on, and driven away. My people call me cursed, but I am still alive. I refuse to die in the dirt." Her words cut through the barn like fire, leaving behind silence. Finally, the fifth widow, the youngest of them, spoke. Her voice was soft, almost childlike. Her skin shimmered faintly under the sunlight coming through the cracks of the barn. "I was married for only 3 days," she said. "He was taken to war before we could even begin our life. He never came back. I never had a chance to love, to build, to dream. Now I am nothing but a widow in a world that wants me dead." Her lips trembled and she lowered her gaze. For a long moment no one spoke. Only the sound of animals stirring in the barn filled the silence. John's heart was heavy, heavier than it had been in years. He saw not just 5 women before him, but 5 broken stories, 5 lives crushed by cruelty. Yet he also saw something else, something faint but real, the spark of survival. They were not here to beg for pity. They were here because they refused to vanish. The tall widow, their unspoken leader, stepped forward again. "Human farmer," she said firmly. "We will not hide our pain, but we will not drown in it either. We offer you our hands, our strength, our labor. We will plow, we will sow, we will harvest, harder than any others. We need no gold, no wages, only food in our stomachs and a roof over our heads. Let us prove we are not a curse, but a blessing." John stared at them. His thoughts swirled like a storm. He knew his neighbors would call him a fool, they would whisper, they would mock, they would threaten. But as he looked at the 5 widows standing tall despite their pain, he knew his heart had already chosen. He took a slow breath and finally spoke. "Then tomorrow," he said, his voice steady though his chest shook. "We work together. This farm is not much, but it will be ours." The widows lowered their heads, relief flooding their faces. Some whispered words in their alien tongue, prayers of thanks. Others wept quietly, clutching their tokens of loss. John turned and walked out of the barn, the morning light warm on his shoulders. He knew the path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, he did not feel alone. He had not just workers now, but 5 broken souls who might one day find strength again. And maybe, just maybe, they would help him find his own. The next few days passed in silence, broken only by the sound of work. The 5 alien widows rose early with the first light of dawn. They worked the soil with their bare hands, lifted heavy tools without complaint, and carried water from the well, even when their backs ached. John had never seen such determination. They were clumsy at first, unused to human farming tools, but they learned quickly, and each day the fields looked more alive than before. At night, John often watched them from the porch. They ate quietly, sometimes whispering in their alien tongue, sometimes staring into the fire with haunted eyes. Their grief was still there, deep in their bones, but so was their will to survive. For the first time in years, the farm was alive with footsteps, voices, and the sound of work. But word spread fast. In the nearby town, whispers turned to gossip, and gossip turned to anger. Some said the human farmer had lost his mind. Others muttered that he had betrayed his own kind by taking in aliens, especially widows from a war that had left deep scars on both sides. It began with a single visitor, old Miller, a farmer whose land touched John's border, came riding up on his horse one afternoon. His face was red with heat and anger. "John!" he shouted from the gate. "Is it true what folks are saying? You got aliens living under your roof?" John stepped forward, his hands rough with soil, his shirt damp with sweat. He did not flinch. "They work here, Miller," he said calmly. "They needed shelter, I gave it." Miller spat on the ground, his eyes sharp as knives. "Shelter? You're bringing trouble onto all of us. Don't you remember the raids? Don't you remember what their kind did? You think they'll plow your fields for nothing? They'll take everything you own, John, you mark my words." John stood still, feeling the heat rise in his chest. He thought of the widows, their tears, their trembling voices, and their broken belongings. "They're not soldiers, Miller," he said firmly. "They're widows. They've lost everything." Miller leaned forward in his saddle, his voice a growl. Widows or not, they're still aliens. And people around here don't forget. You'll bring the whole town's anger down on your head, and when that happens, don't come crying to us. With that, he pulled his reins hard and rode away, leaving dust rising behind him. John knew it would not end there. By the next week, more neighbors came. Some stood at the edge of his land shouting curses. Others came closer, pointing and spitting as the widows worked. One man even threw a rock at the fence, making the youngest widow cry out in fear. John had to stand in front of them, his hands clenched, his voice steady. "This is my farm," he told the angry crowd. "What happens here is my choice." But his words did little to calm them. They left muttering threats, their faces twisted with hatred. That night, the widows gathered in the barn. John found them sitting close together, their faces pale. The tall widow lifted her head, her violet eyes burning with quiet strength. "We knew this would happen," she said softly. "It is always the same. Wherever we go, fear follows." John lowered himself onto a wooden crate. He looked at them one by one. "I can't promise it'll get easier," he admitted, "but I won't turn you out. Not for them, not for anyone." The smallest widow, the one who had lost her children, whispered, "Why risk yourself, human? Farmer, you owe us nothing." John sighed, his gaze heavy on the ground. "Because too many already turned their backs on you, I won't be another." Silence fell again. But this time, it was different. Not hopeless, but heavy with something unspoken. The widows exchanged looks, and for the first time, one of them smiled faintly, though it was small and fragile, like a candle in the dark. The anger outside grew in the following days. Neighbors passed his land more often, watching, whispering. One morning, John found a crude sign hammered into his fence, painted with black letters, "Trader's Farm." He tore it down with shaking hands. Still, the widows did not stop working. Their determination only grew, and John realized they were not just trying to survive, they were trying to prove their worth, to show him and perhaps even the world that they were more than the names people spat at them. But trouble was building. The tension in town was like a storm waiting to break. People gathered in taverns, speaking in harsh tones. Some even began to whisper about driving the aliens out themselves. One evening, as John locked the barn, he saw shadows moving along the far side of his land. He gripped his lantern tight, his heart pounding. He knew the anger of his neighbors was no longer just words. It was turning into something far more dangerous. And deep down, John understood. The choice he had made was not only about saving 5 widows, it was about defying the fear and hatred of an entire town. And that choice would test him, and everyone under his roof, in ways he had not yet imagined. The days that followed were heavy with unease, yet the work of the farm did not stop. From the first light of dawn until the stars appeared, John and the widows toiled in the fields. The land was stubborn and dry, the soil cracked from long neglect, but their hands refused to give in. Every morning John would see them rise from the barn before he even stepped outside. Their faces carried shadows of grief, but their arms carried strength born from hardship. At first their ways were clumsy. They held the plow too tight, spilled more seeds than they saved, and dropped buckets at the well. But John did not shout. He showed them slowly, guiding their hands. His voice was firm but patient, and to his quiet surprise, they learned quickly. Within days, they began moving in rhythm, lifting, sowing, and watering with a steady pace. The tall widow, their silent leader, was the strongest. She carried loads that would have made younger men bend, never asking for rest. Her violet eyes seemed to scan every corner of the farm, as if she feared enemies would appear at any moment. The youngest widow, soft-spoken and still fragile, often stumbled with heavy tools, but she refused to let go. Her hands blistered and bled. Yet she kept working, hiding her pain behind a trembling smile. One evening, John noticed her struggling to carry a bucket nearly as heavy as she was. He walked over, took it from her hands, and said quietly, "You don't have to prove yourself every hour." She looked at him with wide, shining eyes and whispered, "If we stop even for a moment, the world will remind us we don't belong." Her words lingered in John's chest long after he set the bucket down. The farm began to change. Slowly, the broken fences were repaired, the soil softened, and young plants pushed their way into the light. The animals, too, seemed calmer. The widows treated them with gentle care, whispering in their strange tongue as they fed them. It was as if life itself was beginning to return to the land. But the struggle was not only against the soil, it was against the weight of eyes that watched from beyond the fences. Every day neighbors passed by, some glaring, others spitting on the ground. A few shouted cruel words, calling the widows curses, thieves, or worse. Each time, John stood tall, his jaw tight, but he could feel the pressure building like a storm cloud above him. One afternoon, as John and the widows worked near the road, a group of children threw stones, laughing when one struck the youngest widow on her arm. She winced but did not cry out. She only straightened and went back to her task, John's hands clenched around his shovel. His heart screamed to chase them away, but he forced himself to breathe. The widow's quiet endurance was their shield, and he would not let anger strip it away. At night, the barn became more than just a place to sleep. It became their shelter of stories. Around the lantern's glow, the widows whispered of the lives they once had. Homes filled with laughter, voices of husbands lost, children never seen again. Sometimes John would sit outside pretending not to listen, but the words carried through the cracks, and though they spoke in broken human language or their alien tongue, grief sounded the same. One evening, John entered the barn quietly and found them singing. The song was low, filled with sorrow but also with strength. The youngest widow's voice was trembling yet steady. The tall widow's tone was deep and unshaken. Together their voices rose, carrying into the night. John stood there in silence, his heart heavy but strangely comforted. For the first time in years, the farm was not drowned in silence. It was alive with voices that refused to be erased. The struggle, however, was not only outside, it was inside them too. The widows carried wounds that no amount of work could heal. At times, John would find one of them staring at the fields, eyes distant, lost in memory. Another would wake in the night crying out from dreams filled with fire and loss. John wanted to help, but he did not know how, so he did the only thing he could. He stayed, offering his quiet presence, a steady hand, and a roof that would not be taken from them. As the days turned to weeks, John began to notice small changes. The widow's steps grew lighter, their voices less heavy. Sometimes they even laughed softly, sharing small jokes in their tongue. The sound startled John at first, so rare and fragile, but he welcomed it. It was proof that despite everything, life was slowly pushing through the cracks of their sorrow. Yet even as the farm healed, the outside world did not. The whispers in town grew louder, rumors spreading like fire. Some said John was bewitched, others claimed the widows were plotting against him. John ignored the noise, but he knew the peace on his farm was fragile. One angry spark could set everything ablaze. Still, each morning he rose, each day he worked, and each night he watched over the widows as they rested. For John, the struggle was no longer just about saving his farm. It was about protecting the fragile hope that had entered his land. It was about defying the voices that told him compassion was weakness. And deep inside, John felt something he had not felt in years: purpose. The struggle was far from over, but he was no longer alone in it. The widows had become part of his farm, part of his fight, and perhaps, in time, part of his life. Yourself. She looked up at him, her face streaked with rain and tears, and whispered, "I could not save my children, but I can save this farm." Then she pushed past him and kept digging. The youngest widow, barely more than a girl, carried firewood into the house again and again, her small frame shaking with exhaustion but her eyes bright with determination. When John tried to take the load from her, she only said, "You gave us shelter. Now we give it back." Hours dragged on like years. By dawn, the storm finally broke. The rain slowed, the thunder faded, and the first light of morning cut through the clouds. The farm was a mess, mud everywhere, Fences broken, parts of the roof torn, but it still stood. The animals were safe, the crops still rooted, and the widows were alive, though their bodies ached and their hands bled. John stood in the yard, drenched and weary, looking at the 5 women around him. They were covered in mud, their clothes torn, their faces lined with exhaustion. Yet their eyes burned a fire he had never seen before. Not fear, not despair, but pride. The tall widow stepped forward, her voice rough but steady. "We told you we would work harder than any human," she said. "Last night we proved it. We are not curses, we are not burdens, we are part of this farm now." John looked at her, then at the others. His chest swelled with something he could not name. Respect, gratitude, maybe even love. He nodded slowly. "You saved this farm," he said simply. "Without you, it would be gone." The widows bowed their heads, but he could see the faintest smiles on their lips, small but real. For the first time, John felt they were no longer strangers under his roof. They were family, bound not by blood but by struggle. Yet even as they stood together in the ruined yard, John knew this was only the beginning. The storm outside had passed, but the storm of anger in the town was still brewing. The men who came with torches would return, and when they did, it would not be with warnings, it would be with fire and hate. And now, John was not just one man standing alone. He was a man with 5 widows at his side, women who had proven with blood and sweat that they would fight for the farm as if it were their own. The test of loyalty had come in the shape of wind and rain, and they had passed it. But the true test, the one waiting on the horizon, would be far more dangerous. The storm had passed, but the farm still bore its scars. Fences were broken, the soil heavy with water, and pieces of the roof lay scattered in the mud. Yet John stood in the yard with the widows at his side, and for the first time in many years, he felt hope. The farm was still standing, and so were they. Over the next few days, work began again, harder than ever. Together they repaired what the storm had broken. The tall widow with violet eyes led the others as if she had always belonged here, hammering wood into place, tying ropes, and carrying beams with unshaken strength. The youngest widow, though her hands still blistered, followed close behind her, determined to prove she was no burden. The one with glowing scars mended the roof, her steady hands patching what the storm had tried to take. The smallest widow, who had lost her children, worked quietly, planting new seeds in the soaked soil, as if giving life to the farm gave her back a piece of what she had lost. John worked beside them, shoulder to shoulder. Each day their rhythm grew smoother. Each day they moved less like strangers and more like family. When one stumbled, another lifted. When one grew weak, another carried the weight. They were no longer 5 broken widows on a strange farm. They were part of it now. Their loyalty had been tested in storm and struggle, and they had passed with fire in their hearts. But the outside world did not forget. Rumors from town grew darker. The men who had once stood at John's gate returned in whispers and shadows. Some said the farm was cursed. Others swore the widows were witches. Few dared to come near, but John could feel their anger pressing in from beyond the fields. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, old Miller returned. His face was grim, his horse restless. He stopped at the gate and called out, "John, they're planning something." His voice was low, almost regretful. "A meeting in town, men want to drive them out for good. They say if you don't send them away, they'll burn the farm to the ground." John stood silent for a moment, the weight of the words pressing on him. Behind him, the widows stood still, their eyes fixed on Miller. Fear flickered in their faces, but also defiance. "They saved this farm," John said at last, his voice steady. "If the town cannot see that, then let them come, we will not run." Miller shook his head, spitting into the dirt. "You're a fool, John," he muttered, and rode off into the dusk. That night John and the widows prepared. They stacked buckets of water near the barn, gathered tools that could be used as weapons, and kept lanterns burning through the dark hours. The farm was quiet, but every shadow seemed alive. Every rustle in the grass a warning. The attack never came. Perhaps the storm had shaken the men's courage. Perhaps Miller's words had stirred doubt among them. Whatever the reason, the night passed without fire. When morning came, the widows stood in the yard, their eyes red from sleeplessness but still burning with strength. It was then that John realized something. The farm was no longer just his, it belonged to them as well. Their blood, sweat, and tears were in its soil. They had fought for it, protected it, and saved it. They were not outsiders anymore. They were home. Weeks passed, and slowly the anger in town began to fade. The crops grew tall, the animals fattened, and word spread that John's farm was thriving again. Some whispered that it was because of the widows, their strange strength, their relentless labor. Others said it was John's stubbornness, refusing to bow to fear. Whatever the reason, the farm no longer looked cursed, it looked blessed. One afternoon, a child from town wandered into the fields, curious eyes wide as he watched the widows work. Instead of fear, he showed wonder. The smallest widow knelt, offering him a piece of bread. The boy hesitated, then smiled and took it, running back down the road. That moment was small, but it was the beginning of something greater. The wall of hate was beginning to crack. John stood on the porch one evening, watching the widows laugh. Softly among themselves, the sound was new, fragile yet beautiful. He had once thought himself doomed to live and die alone, tending to a dying farm. Now his land was alive with voices, footsteps, and the warmth of belonging. The tall widow approached him, her violet eyes glowing softly in the fading light. "Human farmer," she said quietly, "we came here broken, unwanted, cast aside. But you gave us a place when no one else would. For that, we give you our lives. This farm is yours, and so are we." John looked at her, then at the others. His throat tightened. He had taken them in out of compassion, but they had given him something far greater. They had given him family. They had given him purpose. The farm had once been a place of silence, sorrow, and fading hope. Now it was a place of struggle, loyalty, and rebirth. The widows were no longer beggars at his gate. They were partners in his fight. They were home. And as the stars rose above the farm that night, John knew one thing, with certainty: whatever storms, threats, or hatred came next, they would face it together, not as one man and 5 strangers, but as one family bound by the soil, by the struggle, and by the choice to stand when the world turned its back. It was not just survival anymore. It was the beginning of something new.